It's going live, and we are live. Hi, everybody. This is Jay Sen with the Content Marketing Virtual Summit. Welcome to the fourth day of the event and the fourth live panel. We've had an amazing week so far with just incredible people with in-depth questions, and today I think is going to be great. So let me quickly introduce our live panelists, and then we'll get into the questions. So the first person I'm going to quickly introduce is Dave Dabbah. So Dave, welcome. Dave is the Chief Marketing Officer at Robocorp, and Robocorp is an open source Python-based stack for simplifying automation. And at Robocorp, Dave, as the CMO, works closely with both sales and customer success. He knows clearly what each of those departments goes through and helps to create messaging that resonates with the target audience of Robocorp. So it's great to have you here, Dave. Next, I'm going to introduce Rogelio Rodriguez. Rogelio is the co-founder and CEO of Rizen Inbound. It's an inbound agency specializing in helping tech-savvy businesses succeed through the implementation of proven inbound methodologies to increase traffic, leads, and ultimately customers. So having been in the business world using traditional SEO methods, Rogelio has really enjoyed helping other companies grow through switching to the philosophy of inbound marketing versus just outbound sales. And he describes his approach to helping companies grow as being transformation agents, and really looks at building relationships between his clients and his coworkers as well. He really likes to see them working together as a team. And then we have also from Rizen Inbound, Jeffrey Lambert. And Jeffrey, welcome, is the content coordinator of Rizen Inbound. And it's the same company I mentioned earlier. And Jeff is passionate about finding ways to connect with audiences, how to actually take your content and create that brand, trust, and connection. And one of the interesting things that I learned about Jeff is, it said that he's never met an app or a service that he believes in and hasn't looked at a way to communicate the value to the customer, like understanding how to actually connect people to that service, so that they understand the value they're getting. So that's great. All right, so we're going to get now into welcome everybody, and it's great to have you here. I'm going to get now into the questions. So let me just quickly bring those up. Okay, so the first question is going to be for, I'm going to start off with a question for Dave, just so that a lot of people may not actually know what robot process automation is. So I think just to kick it off, it would be great, Dave, if you could just share a definition of robot process automation, and that way, as people are going through the rest of the conversation, they'll have a better idea what is robot process automation. So the first question, simple. Dave, welcome.
Yeah.
And what is robot process automation?
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me today on the show, and I'm looking forward to talking to the other gentlemen as well. This is a big part of my job, is to help explain what RPA is, as we call it, to people that haven't been involved in RPA, as well as explaining to the enterprise corporations who have been using or utilizing RPA over the last 3 or 4 years, what the second generation of RPA is. I think at this point, if I were flying on an airline, when it comes to content production, I'd be boarding first and be upgraded to first class every time out, just because of the sheer amount of content that we have to produce at this point. So robotic process automation, and I'm going to explain this to you guys in sort of a real life scenario sense. If you're a financial services company, a fintech company, a bank, and you want to set up online purchase processing, you're going to end up connecting with a variety of different systems to make that actually happen. Robotic process automation actually goes out and pulls information from various systems and passes that information back into a central location, depending on where you want the information to go. One of the easiest ways to sort of think about RPA as a whole is if there's like a menial task that we would have called a menial task back in the day, where somebody calls into a customer service department and some information is filled out on a piece of paper in the old days, all the way through to Excel spreadsheets into CRM and Salesforce automation systems today. That information is then sent automatically from one place to another for processing. And RPA actually makes it possible to sort of remove the human element of that. And at the core, that's really what we do. We essentially create digital workers that are able to handle what used to be sort of time-consuming, boring tasks that humans had to do. Now, the more advanced part of that happens on the server level side. And that's really where Robocorp lives today. So anyways, hopefully that made some sense, but you guys can sort of see the challenge we have of RPA and how to sort of bring that message to the masses.
Yeah, it does make sense, Dave. Thanks for sharing that. And I think to summarize sort of the way you explained it, which I think was really helpful, is that there's a lot of specific things that you're bringing data from one system to another system. And an example is somebody might have two computer screens, and they're essentially taking it from Excel in this particular screen and putting it into Salesforce in that screen, as an example, right? Yeah. And they just do that repeatedly over and over and over and manually. And then as that's going on, lots of errors are happening, and people are waiting. There's a lot of other things that are being blocked in the steps that could happen. And now with something like robot process automation, you can actually automate something like that. And that's just a very, very simple example. But anytime you have two different systems that need to talk to each other, that's one example. And the other one I think you might say is even within the same system, where sometimes information sits in one place, needs to move to another, and there's no easy way to do that. And then again, it's a two screens kind of thing, and they're kind of trying to move it from here to there.
I'll just put this in. Jeffrey, I've never spoken with you before. I'm just picking on you because your first name is easier to pronounce. If Jeffrey were applying to a bank for a home loan, so somebody would take Jeffrey's information. That information would go into a system. What would then happen, like a Salesforce automation or something more advanced than that. So then what would happen is at one time, one of the digital workers would go out to one of the credit unions and pull Jeffrey's, by the way, crystal clear credit report, I'm sure, and would bring that report back. As simultaneous to that, another digital worker would go out to TransUnion, another one of the companies, and they would put that information into that system. While that's happening, Jeffrey's still talking about his dogs and his cats with the rep on the phone, about his, he's looking for a bigger backyard. And while all of that's happening, then a assessment is being made on the back end automatically about what Jeffrey actually qualifies for against the bank's metrics. And so that's, just another sort of quick way of thinking about this.
Thank you, David. That's really cool. So it can also integrate data. It can go out in the background and do things while humans are doing other things. And it's probably, there's a lot of things we can dive into, and we're just getting started. So we'll come back and talk more about that. Very quickly, I'm going to do the same thing now with Rogelio. And I'm going to actually ask you to, a lot of people here in this event are pretty well knowledgeable about marketing and content and growth. But for some people who may not be as familiar, what is your definition of inbound marketing versus outbound marketing? And let's start with that, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question.
Sure. Jay, thanks for having us once again. This is fantastic. Learning about Robocorp just now, I'm like eyes are open. But to answer your question, really, inbound is about non-intrusive, right? Being able to attract people versus interrupt them versus, and then I'll give you an example of interruptions are commercials during Hulu, right? Like in the middle of a Hulu cast. And inbound really focuses on the target market and the audience and building content to attract those individuals based on what their pains, what their questions are, what their needs are. And it takes a lot of effort to understand the target audience and then turn that into content that would be remarkable to them, right? And make sure that it engages them by providing them the solutions that they're looking for.
Great. So just in summary for your definition, which I think is really helpful, a lot of people traditionally have been essentially doing push marketing where they're kind of interrupting people different ways. Advertising is one of the common ones, like you said, Hulu. And it's not really when people are looking for that information. And then inbound is essentially flipping the script and saying the customer's in control, as you're sharing, and let's let them get the information when they need and make it easy for them to kind of come to us. Great. Thanks so much, Rogelio. And then Jeffrey, I'm going to ask you a definitional question as well, sort of get everybody on the same playing field, which is from your point of view, when you think about content creation and a content creation process, if you could just quickly explain what is the difference between having a content creation process and just creating content, and just very briefly for people to understand that difference.
Yeah, sure. I will be the third one to say thank you, Jay, for having us here tonight. I do appreciate that. And Dave, you almost perfectly described my life about 10 months ago when I was going through the process of buying a home. So I don't know, maybe you worked at the bank at one point, or your software is just really good at being able to pinpoint, what the average buyer is going through. So I'm impressed on that front. Jay, to answer your question, what is the difference between just putting out content and actually having a content strategy or a content roadmap? That really comes down to answering the question, where do I want to end up before you start the journey? So it's kind of equivalent to getting in a car and just driving, or getting into the car and making sure you have your destination plugged into Google Maps before you actually start the trip there. And I think a lot of times we make the mistake as content marketers trying to do things just quickly, get it out there and say, we're just going to increase sales. But we don't think about what the journey the customer is taking in order to get to that point. And we have to really think about, how do we want to attract them first stages, and just getting them to know who we are and what we stand for, and understanding our product, like what you were saying, Dave. Once they understand who we are and what our product is, what's the benefits of said product? How do we compare to the competition? And then moving them through to thinking about, do I want to try this out? Is there some sort of opportunity for me to be able to really see if this stands up to where I've come thus far in my journey? If we don't plan those things out, it's going to turn into a mess at some point down the road. And so I think it's really important, content marketers, we tend to be on the creative side. We tend to be more abstract, I think, in a lot of ways in our thinking, but we have to really harness the analytical side too, and make sure that we are very carefully planning out where we want the customer to end up with our content. So there's a purpose to what we're doing.
So in kind of what you're sharing, Jeff, is that people who are not having a content strategy, they sort of are, it makes sense why they don't necessarily have confidence in their content, because they end up, sort of fire ready aim, right? They're just putting stuff out there, hoping it works, and then later on wondering what happened. And so your point is that in order to increase the chance of having it become successful, they need to step back and have a content strategy first, and then organize the content to actually towards a goal, a business goal. And I think you're going to talk a little bit later about, and you do in your talk at the Content Marketing Virtual Summit, you talk about that as well, like the critical aspect of connecting with the customer, and we'll come back and talk about that in a minute. So Dave, back to you for another, kind of slice at understanding robot process automation, and robot process automation, I guess, abbreviated as RPA. And I think the first question that people might have is this something that just happened recently, like in the last year or so, that robot process automation is starting to happen? And I think you mentioned earlier there's a difference between robot process automation 1 and 2, right?
Yeah.
So maybe you could briefly describe, when did robot process automation actually, like, is it just recently, and what is the key difference between version 1 and 2?
Yeah. So I won't bore you all with a journey back to the birth date of RPA, but sort of the traditional sense of RPA is really no more than 6 or 7 years old at this point.
Wow.
It's one of those things where automations have been happening for quite some time. There's been a lot of work done with bot automation. Most of that work was really on the business side done in test automation. And so there was a sort of a shift, 6 or 7 years ago, when some of the first generation, what we like to call them the Gen 1 RPA providers, first really sort of hit the market. And to kind of give you guys a sense of this as well, a couple of those companies have grown so fast. 2 of them are public. One is in the process of going public. These are, $1 billion plus companies now. And so we entered the market with Gen 2 RPA. And our company launched about a year and a half ago. It's really not that old. We introduced Gen 2 RPA to the world about 6 months ago. And the difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2, and you guys are all content marketers, so you might like this. I've tried to explain that the Gen 1 providers are like black and white television, and Gen 2 is a crystal clear 8K TV. And the differences in the what happens on the back end side are dramatic. And most of that, I won't get into the nitty-gritty details around it, but most of it revolves around the speed that it takes to process automations. So that when Jeffrey was on the call looking for that house, that process went extremely fast, and they didn't have to say, we'll get back to you in 24 hours. So speed of process automation is one of the things. Another thing is ability to grab multiple pieces of information at the same time. We call this parallel processing. And that is a major advantage in a Gen 2 RPA solution. The third thing is a little old school now, but that is cloud native versus on-prem. And we've all seen, this shift in cloud versus on-prem technology over the last 15 years. And there's been more and more of an acceptance about where your data is stored. Are you comfortable with it being stored in the cloud? Same thing is happening here, just in an accelerated process in the RPA space. And that accelerated process is the Gen 1 providers did not want to use anything related to cloud for the actual orchestration of the bots. And we've completely sort of flipped that on its head. And so that's another sort of key component. And the last thing, and I'll try not to ramble here, the last thing real quick is the Gen 1 providers had a very old school approach when it comes to software licensing and enterprise licensing. So they would charge you for every bot license that you have, every bot runner, as we would call it. And you would have to pay annual fees for each of those licenses. What we've introduced to the market is consumption-based pricing, which basically just means you just pay for the minutes that your bots actually run. And what that's done is it's changed the barrier to entry point for companies into RPA. In Gen 1, you'd have to spend, really, when you get down to the consultants and everything, and the services and the infrastructure costs, you're spending, $250,000 to $1 million just to get off the ground. And with us, you can, sort of get off the ground now for $40,000 or $50,000. It's different for every instance, so I don't want to say everybody's getting off the ground for that. But it is allowing a lot more companies to start to utilize Gen 2 RPA.
Great. So just kind of a couple critical points. It's a lot more flexible. You can get in at a lower price, and you don't have to essentially lock yourself in to an annual license, and then maybe you need more resources or less resources. You can actually start with a more flexible process, and then as your business grows or as you have seasonality, then if you get flooded with a lot of insurance claims all of a sudden, then the Gen 2 will actually adapt, if you will, versus Gen 1, you're kind of locked in. It's very rigid. So the quick summary of I don't think I hit all the points, but I think just some of the key features that I think you mentioned. So that's
Jay, you're doing so good. I'm going to hire you.
Awesome. Let's have that conversation. So the next thing is to Rogelio. So a lot of people are really curious about, how to understand cost per lead, and specifically when they're using paid ads to generate cost per lead. And so in terms of your, sort of experience, maybe you could talk a little bit about, I think one of your case studies was at a company called Logica, Logica, and it's a team of attorneys. And maybe you could walk through a little bit about, for a team of attorneys, what are some of the things you've learned about how they should approach thinking about paid ads and having a process so that they can actually grow their attorney services with a, kind of understanding cost per lead?
Sure. That's I think, a great question. A lot of our customers are constantly asking for that. We use tracking tools, right? That both analytics tools and then a little bit more advanced tracking tools like HubSpot that allow us to really have a complete understanding of return on investment even from the ad that's created, right? And the creative on that ad itself, both for Facebook, AdWords, Google Ads, and LinkedIn, right? So a lot of it has to do with the tools, the capability of the tools to be able to track that specific instance. We also use call tracking to see which of the ads are actually generating the calls into an office. And all of that gets aggregated into one database, right? And that one database is the holder of that information. And then what we do is we create reports around that data that's being collected. And I mean, just to think through the Logica example, right? Like they were really interested in going after like a very, very specific niche. They do business immigration mostly, where they're trying to attract individuals that maybe there are more opportunities in the US than there are professionals. So they have specific visa programs that allow those individuals to get into the country based on employment. And they're looking for the employers. So the entire campaign that we put together was based on creating an ad campaign targeting those employers that are hiring potential candidates, right? It's called H-1B candidates. And in that instance, we used Google Analytics, HubSpot to track the actual visits on the website and the conversions. And then we also use HubSpot to track the sale of whatever happened, that engagement, right? Like, so when the individual decided to engage with the customer, we were able to track that process inside the tool, and therefore tying back that, hey, look, this campaign was able to bring us, $20,000 the first year, and we just spent like just a little over $4,000 to reach those $20,000 in profit, right? So with the right tools in place, you can track anything. I mean, like, even just looking at Robocorp, the website, I just signed up just to test it out, because I can see how these automations and the data collection process can help other businesses. As long as you have the right technology in place, you're able to track anything.
So just very quickly, one of the things you're saying is that when you're looking at cost per lead or paying for leads, paying for ads, for getting leads, especially we were using an example of Loijica, which is a immigration attorney firm in Miami, that the critical thing is what happens after somebody clicks and becomes a lead. And if somebody clicks and becomes a lead, and then you essentially treat that as a one-shot thing, and that's all you're tracking, is that, okay, we spent this much money, we got this many clicks, and we got this many leads, then you're basically operating blind, because what you're saying, Rogelio, is that it's all the magic that happens once they become a lead, and then they become a qualified lead, and then a sale, and then you start getting recurring income. And if you can track all that back to the actual cost per lead, now you've got a full picture.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll be able to see, like, so we have another client that, like, we work closely with, and I know that, like, his cost per leads is $197. So then we know, hey, we can budget, $20,000 and get this many leads for you based on that, on the previous metrics that we were tracking of lead cost. So
great, yeah. And so the other point you mentioned, and I think this is really important, is that you integrated different mechanisms of communication, like call tracking. Yeah. And could you briefly describe why you did that, and sort of why you think that's important?
Sure. Just in the overall scheme of things, it's you have to think about how your audience prefers to communicate, right? Some individuals like going on the chat systems on websites. Other individuals prefer to call. So if you're not tracking those calls, you're missing out on those opportunities. You're missing out on understanding which type of how your audience is wanting to interact with you. So you have to set a system in place that allows you to be fluid in the way that you communicate with your specific audience.
Yeah, and for an attorney, I can imagine that a large number of people click the ad, come to their website, and then pick up the phone.
Yes.
And so if you're not tracking if you're not tracking the calls, then you're getting a very distorted view, and people might stop spending on ads because they think it's not working.
Right.
And then actually it is working. It's just that they're not measuring all the interactions that are being driven from those ads. So kind of two key points. I think you mentioned this in your talk at the summit as well, which is really thinking more deeply about interactions that happen after the first touch point, and understanding the full picture. So that's great. And I recommend the talks by Jeff and Rogelio and Dave are really in depth. So I do recommend you guys go check those out if you're listening to the live panel now. The next question is going to be for Jeffrey. Okay, and this one is going to be about content creation. So this is from somebody anonymous. And the question is, I'm a digital marketing executive for a high-end private school. I'm noticing that the younger generation of parents are consuming more information online, and decide on what private school to send their kids. And I've been thinking about publishing a weekly blog and video content for our social media. I'm wondering, what your advice is for sort of how you would approach that. And what kind of content do you think could attract the parents specifically? So yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, it's a good question overall, and education is such a shifting environment right now. as we see, so many different options popping up in terms of what you can choose for your child. There's a lot more competition, especially amongst the non-public sectors. I spent 13 years in education, actually, as a teacher and an administrator. So I connect with what you're trying to do. And I guess what I would say overall, where I would start is I think it is a good idea to start with thinking about publishing some written content, creating some video content that's mainly educational in nature and talks about what your school has to offer. What's the benefit to enrolling your child in this school? But I think you need to take a step back even more than that and take time to figure out who is the target parent, the target family that you want attending your school. We all know it as the buyer persona, and it sounds simple. It's something we learned senior year in college, but a lot of times that's a step that's skipped over, and it really needs to be considered very strongly before you start creating your content. There's a big difference between thinking about if you want to target families who maybe are in a middle income spectrum, 1 to 2 kids, are focused mainly on a 4-year liberal arts college education. Is your program going to line up with what they're looking for? You may be trying to compete based on what your school offers for a moral or a religious background. You may be considering competing on your sports program, but you have to figure out what the parents want. You have to figure out what your audience wants before you start creating the content. So everything you're saying is great. It's a good idea to make that content, videos, written posts, great entry points for parents, but please make sure you go back and figure out who the target parent is before you start creating said content.
So your advice to them, Jeffrey, is to start by identifying their target, who they're communicating with, and you called that a buyer persona, and a lot of people at the event knows what a buyer persona is. But from your point of view, what exactly is a buyer persona, and very briefly, how would you recommend someone go about actually developing, a buyer persona, their buyer persona?
For sure. I think a good buyer persona, a good basic buyer persona has 3 parts. You have the demographic information, you have the goals, and you have the challenges. So if you can really thoroughly hit on those 3 areas of what you want your target audience to be, you're going to be in great shape. So again, thinking about what region are the families that I want to target? Where do they live? What does the nuclear family situation look like for people that are already attending my school who have an interest in my school? Looking at those demographic information, and then looking at what are the goals. Like I said, overall, you need to think about what your school's benefits are, all of us, what our organization's benefits are, and what we can offer said individuals, and make sure that aligns with what they're looking for. You are wasting your time if you are putting out messaging talking about your sports program when there's a school down the street that has a D1 situation already set up. What's your differentiating value? And you got to figure out what those people want and then go get them.
Okay, got it. So a buyer persona is like a kind of an idealized version of who you're communicating with their emotional needs and their psychological needs, not just their superficial description. So you kind of think about what their world looks like, what their other concerns are that surround the decision you're going to help them with, your brand's going to help them with. And having that means that you can then line your whole team up around it, right? You can get your writers involved, you can get your advertisers involved, your branding people involved. So that's really helpful. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about buyer personas in a minute. And I think you cover it really well in your talk, Jeffrey, at the event. You really did a great job of explaining more about that. So thanks so much for sharing that. This is going to lead really well to Dave, because the question here is the buyer persona of the developer. And for Robocorp, you actually have the buyer persona, if you will, of the company that might be using robotic process automation or RPA. But you also have another buyer persona, if you will, of the developer. If you could briefly talk about, as a CMO, how you address thinking about a buyer persona. Maybe you could describe what is the buyer persona of a developer for robot process, for our Robocorp, and how you communicate with them.
Yeah. Well, first thing I want to do is thank Rogelio for lowering our cost per leads. I got a Slack notification that you had signed up. So there you go.
I'll do it for you too, Dave. Don't worry.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So, we have the challenge, and I've had this challenge at a couple companies in the last 10 years of you're multiple targeting. So, you know, you're targeting decision makers, which just sounds like such a general term. But those tend to be non-developers, and then you're also targeting developers as well. And when we do a lot of deep analysis on where leads come from, and how they got to us, and we do the best that we can do with limited information. I'll give you guys just a quick anecdote here. So we spend some money, right? We throw out some Google ads on open source RPA, and so we're running ads on open source RPA, and my demand gen guy comes back to me and he's like, you know, we're not generating any leads off of it. And, you know, like, I mean, like the signups that we're getting from it are sort of minimal, and I don't understand what's happening, and why that's happening. And so it becomes really complex, because in the developer community, developers don't want to sign up until they played with the code in Git, or they've downloaded a free version of what we have before we ever ask them to give us any information. So we have that interesting challenge of spending money, targeting developers, getting them to play around with technology that we have no idea whether or not they're using it or not. So what we've been able to do over time is correlate those things that are happening with direct signups. Rogelio messed that up for us today, but that's okay. So we're able to like really sort of like look at that, and we're able to sort of figure out what the difference is. From a persona standpoint, the way a purchase works is a developer who's involved with RPA at their company might just start looking for an alternative vendor, an alternative solution for RPA. So they might just start playing with a company like Robocorp on the side. And once they do sign up, we grab that information. I'm sure very similar to what you guys do. We run some intent data against it, and then we expand who we're essentially want to speak with inside that company. And then we start actually going into the department in which we believe is actually looking for the RPA solution. I'll just use like the CFO's office as an example here. CFO offices, HR departments, CTO teams. Those are our sort of direct. Those are the people that are going to be making purchasing decisions. And it's usually the purchasing decisions usually made at a VP level for the size of companies that we target. And so that's the journey there, where the developer is essentially playing with the product, playing with the tool. We'll have to certify it once somebody is to ask them to go look at it. They need to feel comfortable with all of the content that we produce and provide for them, not just in our resource center, but also in the product itself. And that's a key area that a lot of startups don't spend any time on, is providing content inside the product. And the journey doesn't end, you know, at sign up. It continues through the use of the product. So that's something we're building more and more into our overall processes.
So thanks, Dave. So the number one thing I think that you help to clarify is that you're actually dealing with two different types of buyer personas. The first one is sort of the developer that's going to adopt, and they tend to want to be kind of try the code and test it out. And so one of the key things you've done is really understand where do they discover tools and automations that they can try out. And so that's your first, if you will, kind of category of quote unquote buyer persona. And then the second one you're saying is actually like the organizational decision maker. And that's where people are choosing what to do. 1 second, my alarm just went off. 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So while you get your alarm turned off, what's really interesting is you take an enterprise corporation and you take the CFO's office, you take the HR team's office, and then you go, hang out with the IT folks, and they're all running different RPA solutions, and they had no idea. So that's also like the other interesting thing about robotic process automation is you think you end up in a company and then you land and expand, but these corporations are so big that that a lot of these decisions are made on the departmental level, and those departments are it's not like the CFO and the head of HR are talking about RPA in their executive meetings. It happens at the level below it, and so there's not a ton of communication that's happening there.
Okay, great. All right, so I think that's really a good example of buyer personas. Dave is actually dealing with different types of buyer personas and digging into their understanding and different ways to communicate with them, and especially the developer in your case is kind of wants to try things hands-on. And as you said, on the other side, it's the decision makers, and it could even be a level down. So we'll come back to that. So next, we're going to go to Rogelio, and this is a question about lead generation. So the question is, my company is a B2B tech startup, and just want some input on any ideas you have about combining different, paid channels and organic channels for lead generation, or sequencing, which one I should do first. We've tried Facebook ads, LinkedIn outreach, Google ads. We're doing some content and SEO, but we've heard it's going to take a while, 6 to 9 months. So this is a case where it's a fintech company. They're trying to attract maybe retail people to join their platform. And they're wondering, from your point of view, kind of being an innovator, what your recommendations would be about trying multiple channels at once versus trying them in a sequence. Any inputs you could provide to them?
Sure. I'm not sure if I heard you. Did you say B2B fintech for? You said B2B fintech, right?
They're a B2B. Yeah, they're a B2B tech fintech company. Yes.
Okay. All right. I mean, I think the best way and where you have to start is just an assessment of who you're targeting, right? For whenever I think about cash strapped, I think ABM. I mean, he mentioned that like they're taking into consideration their budget, right? So I would come up with a very guerrilla style of approaching lead generation, almost breaking it down to the things that you have complete and total control. LinkedIn outreach is fantastic. I think Google Ads may work in the form of retargeting once you start getting a lot of traffic from your LinkedIn outreach, because you can drive traffic from outreaching to people on LinkedIn consistently if you use certain automation tools as well. Internally, we use a tool called Expandy for LinkedIn message automation, and it works fantastic. I mean, it's consistently giving us referrals right now, right, from the interactions that we're using. Man, SEO is a long-term play. I would still write and take SEO into consideration, but I would definitely bring that in-house or produce it in-house, all the content and as well. And Facebook ads would be, I think, great if you have already some form of understanding of what that audience is, right, based on interest. But you got to be a little bit more careful. I think you have to test the messaging on Facebook, and based on that message testing, create ads on other platforms from there. And yeah, I mean, I think those are all great ways. I would just confirm that SEO is a long-term play, and investing in that is, you got to be ready to spend money if you want to for it to take effect faster, right? It's about volume of content production at that point. And
so partly what you're saying is that are you saying, Rogelio, that they should try like Google ads and LinkedIn ads and Facebook ads all at the same time? Or
well, not LinkedIn ads, I was saying LinkedIn outreach. So there's ways that you can reach individuals, right? Like I said ABM early. ABM is account-based marketing. So identifying your accounts that you want to bring on to as customers, reach out to them on LinkedIn, and then combine that with Google retargeting. Right after you reached out to a certain amount of people, you have a large enough audience that's arriving to your website that that then you can retarget on Google with ads, which is more cost effective than creating a search ad, let's say, targeting them based on intent, right? So that's how I would use it, and use Facebook as a testing tool to test your messaging. Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Especially with the part where, using LinkedIn as a way of identifying a list of people, specifically account-based marketing approach, then doing sort of personalized outreach, because you can learn a lot about that person before you do the outreach. And I think you talk about that a bit as well in your talk at the Content Marketing Virtual Summit, and then coming back and actually not just having the one touch point, but keeping your brand in front of them using retargeting, and then having a process to engage them as you're going forward. And you're suggesting that there's some content creation happening also, but with sort of the idea that it's going to take a while, but you don't necessarily, therefore you don't want to delay that. You want to actually start that sooner, and then have that just be something going on in the, as you're accelerating your paid strategy and your follow-up strategy.
Yep. Exactly.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
The next question is going to be to Jeffrey. So the question is around content creation. So we're a firm of chartered certified accountants and business advisors. I'm a marketing coordinator, and I also do content writing for the company. I'm having a hard time creating content. And the question is, what are some tips that you have around creating good content? And as our company wants to publish on a regular basis, like possibly weekly. And what are your thoughts about sort of generally, if somebody wants to be publishing content on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, they're having a hard time, what would you recommend as far as some tips there? And secondly, they want to they're wondering about hiring a freelance writer versus doing it in-house, and any tips you have about that. Oh, you're on mute, by the way, still.
My apologies.
No worries.
It's a great question from the person that submitted that. And I think it's something we all go through as content marketers, trying to figure out whenever we take on a new client or we start a new job with a certain company, you look at the subject material and you look at the product. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves sometimes and look at it and say, am I the best person to be creating this content at this point in my journey? And, speaking, I believe you mentioned that he was a coordinator in a coordinator role, Jay. That should open up some options for you to be able to ask that question freely and say, maybe I don't have the in-depth subject knowledge to be tackling this myself at this point. And if that's the case, then you have to really look at that objectively and say, there's probably better people to be doing this. I just need to create a layout for what I want the content to look like. So don't be afraid to outsource and delegate. There are so many qualified contractors out there in different industries. I mean, you can find someone who's an expert in whey protein for bodybuilders under 65 years old. You can really drill down with the subject matter material here and finding someone who's qualified to help you produce that content. So asking yourself that question honestly first, I think, is really important. And then the second question I would really ask myself overall is, if I'm not that person, how can I make sure that the person I'm giving it to is going to be able to succeed in what I'm asking them to do. So I think it's really important, A, to make sure that you, again, going back to the roadmap layout, exactly what are the goals in my content. We use what's called the content compass. You can Google it. We're #1 on search rankings for that. And it's basically just a spreadsheet that gives you a 12-month layout where you can lay out your KPIs, what you want your different content types to be, what the overall keywords you're trying to rank for, and your goals overall, and just lay out like 90 days at a time. You can do all 12 months, but put it down so you actually have a roadmap on where you're going. So I think that's the key to creating good content on a regular basis. Plan it out ahead of time so you know week 1 I'm doing this, week 2 I know I'm going into this, and it links together and it makes sense and it's not just scattershot. So that would be my first tip. And then the second tip I would say is make sure you're setting up, well, yourself if you're doing it yourself, but also your writers for success. I use a template that I've created over the years to give to my contractors when I'm asking them to write content for me or create content for me. And it's a mix of technical and creative. It's letting them know this is what we want to sound like. This is how we structure our content. These are the keywords we want to rank for. These are the links we want to include in our content, both inbound and outbound. And I want my contractors to be able to look at that and be like, oh, wow, this is great. I can get right into this to be able to do my job. So by making sure we take the time to be able to set up the people who are helping us create the content for success, we're making our jobs a lot easier in the long run. So just to recap, plan ahead of time, make sure you have a roadmap that goes more than a week, and make sure that you are setting up the people who are helping you for success by laying out what specifically you want them to do and what it wants to look like at the end result.
Great, that's really helpful. I think having that 3-step process is really helpful, like having a plan and then also making it easier for people to succeed, in creating the content you want, and then looking for the people that are going to have the expertise. In this case, it's a chartered financial accountant firm.
Yeah.
So there could be people that are actually, have an accounting background and could write really knowledgeably about that, and also translate that into their buyer, the easy language of the buyer, so that it's not maybe too technical, which could be a big advantage as well from hiring somebody outside. So that's great. And I like that editorial calendar perspective where you can go 90 days or a year. That's really helpful, Jeff. Thank you so much. I think you talk about that as well as at your talk at the summit. So that's great.
Yeah, we do.
So now we're going to go around final questions. So this is going to be to Dave as a CMO, and the question will be sort of for other CMOs. And from your perspective, given there's an explosion of all these different, especially software companies out there, and different, it's moving so quickly. What are you doing? Sort of what's your advice to other CMOs in terms of handling that explosion of if you will, competition in the software space, and how to stand out?
Yeah. Jeffrey, I enjoyed your answer. I thought that was really good. The thing I actually always try to tell people about just content as a whole is make it memorable if you can. And I get it, like accounting content might not be the most memorable thing, but we did this. We wrote this article, which we posted on our LinkedIn page, which was like, Bob the bot broke down, and we know why. Just trying to sort of make things memorable, I think, is extremely important from a content production standpoint. For other people running marketing organizations, if you're Series A, Series B, or all the way through to an IPO, and I've had the chance of doing all 3 of those, I will say that the content that you produce, what sometimes happens is you forget who your persona is and who you're producing content for, and so we all understand, the basic principles of demand gen, and how retargeting works, and ABM programs, and how to sort of bring all of those things together under a single roof. And one of the big things is is the content that you're utilizing during those purchasing and buyer journeys really the right content that those people need? And I think it does take a while. I'll say this. CMOs are an endangered species. We are dinosaurs just roaming the world, looking up at the sky for the asteroid that's about to hit us. We don't have a lot of time in our roles to get these things right. And so we have to sort of move fast with the way we position things, the way we brand things, and how we make things memorable. And so that's something that I've tried to bring to these kinds of startups when I've joined them. We've, for God's sakes, we've got a monkey called Mark the Monkey, who flies into outer space and does robot process automation. We are keeping things light because we understand our developer community and the things that work with them, and we understand that that's slightly different than the people that work in the CFO's office. And so we produce different styles of content for those particular groups.
So I think one thing you're saying in sharing with that, and thanks for sharing that, Dave, is that you're saying that one of your roles is to go beyond boring and essentially give people who are actually consuming your content a reason to enjoy it. And kind of ideally, like you gave some examples of a couple characters. I think one is the one that's the monkey that's struggling with something and going in. I don't recall if they went into what kind of adventure they had, but as a result of that, what kind of response did you get from developers to that? How did you see the community responding to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to talk to developers who are running Robocorp today, they actually know the monkey's name. They know Mark the Monkey, so we're doing some. We've got some things coming out in the upcoming months with we've got the most interesting monkey in the world campaign that's coming out, and Mark the Monkey's doing different things along the lines that sort of crosses over beyond the developer community into sort of our targets, the other personas and targets that we go after from a fun and creative way. Mark is to an extent embedded in the brand, and it's sort of our job to not use them too much, to use them just enough to sort of give that nice enterprise feel to the brand as well.
Great. So people are recognizing this character, they're relating to them, and it's giving them a kind of a fun way to approach a fairly technical subject. So that's great. Thanks so much, Dave. So Rogelio, I think final question to you, and this is about bridging marketing and sales. What would you say from your point of view is like a couple best practices for organizations to bridge marketing and sales?
Sure. Bridging marketing and sales. I mean,
or to even be more specific, do you feel that sales sometimes could they take advantage of the kind of the all the contents being produced by the marketing team, and actually have you seen that there are any best practices around having sales benefit from that directly in their communications with potential buyers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean, just thinking about the meetings we have with our customers and attempting to align their revenue teams, right? That marketing and sales is a revenue team together. Their marketing is creating the leads, sales is hopefully closing on those leads. But number one, I would say aim for alignment. Make sure that the goals are tied to both teams. One on marketing, maybe generating enough leads for sales, and then on the sales side, making sure that they they're committed to closing a certain amount of leads, right? Number two, I would say for marketing to ask sales for feedback from the front line, right? Because sales is speaking to the customers. And then based on that feedback they receive, make that the driving force for the content that they're going to produce. And on the other side, for sales to make sure that they have all the context behind the marketing, right? Behind the journey of that customer or that prospect that came into being, right? So that they understand what content they consume, so they can have better conversations, deeper conversations with that person. So yeah, those three
Great,
things.
that's really helpful. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to all of our panelists today. This has been an amazing session, and I really encourage everyone who's listening to go and dive into the talks that Jeffrey, Rogelio, and Dave have presented at the Content Marketing Virtual Summit. So thank you so much for being panelists today. Dave Dabbah of Robocorp, Rogelio Rodriguez of Rizen Inbound, and Jeffrey Lambert of Rizen Inbound. Thank you so much. And this is Jay Sen, host of the Content Marketing Virtual Summit. Hope you all enjoyed it and look forward to having amazing speakers and panelists such as Dave and Rogelio and Jeffrey participate going forward. And also, most importantly, thank you for being such a great audience. All right, everybody, see you in the next event. And we have a full day coming up, so definitely make sure you follow all of the talks today and share them and get as much about, let us know what was most valuable to you. Thanks again. See you in the next session coming up soon. Give it a second.